Good morning, First Baptist Church. I'm so glad you're joining me this morning for our virtual Sunday school class. This morning we're going to be in Exodus chapter 14. We're going to start with verses 19 and go through 31. This is going to be the text that Kobe teaches from today as well. Once again, I'm going to bring a couple of differing perspectives to the table for us to discuss, and then also look at the structure of this scripture. So if you will turn to Exodus chapter 14, verse 39, I'm going to be reading from the NRSV version, which will be the same as what Kobe reads from this morning for our worship service. So Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 19 and going through verse 31. Verse 19. The angel of God who was going before the Israelite army moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. It came between the army of Egypt and the army of Israel, and so the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night. One did not come near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them. All of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So one of the first things that I'm going to point out here is something that's super obvious. We all probably already know this just from being in church, whether we grew up in church, going to Sunday school, or if we're new, we've probably heard this story about the Red Sea. And along with this story comes some conflicting beliefs. Some people say that this was not talking about the Red Sea, this was talking about a sea of reeds, because the word that was used here in Hebrew translates literally to the sea of reeds. But the other side says there's no way there's this cosmic, divine power to this story. That means we have to believe that it was literally the Red Sea and that God parted the Red Sea. So these two beliefs kind of conflict each other. One of them makes it seem like God is great and powerful, and the other one almost seems like we're taking away from the power of God, and we're making this story seem like God is not rather that the story is using natural phenomenon. So with the Sea of Reeds, um, they believe that it was a marshy area that had tides that would dry up. And so when it dried is when the Israelites crossed. And then as they were crossing is when the tide was coming back in, um, making it difficult for the Egyptians to cross over. But the problem with that is, um, if it's just a tide, if it's just a marshy tide, why would it say that God threw the army into the sea? And even then, how would they be dead from being thrown into the sea, um, and being on the seashore? So that's just a thought there for you guys to look at and think about. Is, you know, is this a story about um, a large, massive sea, or is this a story about a sea of reeds that's using natural contexts um, to get the point across? But the next thing is what I really want to focus on today, and we're going to talk about the structure that this passage is written in. So Exodus chapter 14 and 15 are three versions of the Red Sea crossing. So in chapter 15, we know it as the Song of Moses. So it's kind of a retelling of what happened there from Moses' perspective. But then in chapter 14, we have two versions um, of this story. And many people don't know this because uh, it's written as one. But there are actually two versions there, and they're interwoven. So it's not like verse 19 through 25 is version 1 and 26 through 31 is version 2. They're kind of interwoven, and you can see some of the differences very clearly, but we'll talk about that real quickly. So like I said, Exodus 15 is what we know as the Song of Moses, and then chapter 14, which is what we're looking at today, um, there are two proses. And so a prose is just a, a good, easy flow of writing. So it would be like your textbooks, your newspapers, that style writing is just, it's just there to give you information, but it should flow really well. There shouldn't be any kind of breaks in it. Um, but so the first one is known as the non-priestly prose, um, and it it focuses on God being the subject of all action. And so it talks about um, the divine cloud, the smoke, the fire. It talks about God driving back the sea. Um, it talks about how the pillar of fire and cloud is used to push the Egyptians into the sea to drown them, and how at night that divine cloud is what's used to separate the two groups of people. And so this one really focuses on God being the subject of all action. And so we don't really see the importance of people or natural occurrences. It just focuses on God's power and the strength that he has over everything. And so the second one, the second prose, is known as the priestly prose. Um, and so in the priestly prose, we see God using something as a mediator. And so he uses Moses, he uses the wind, he uses natural phenomenon, as well as um, hypernatural phenomenon. And so with the priestly prose, we see the Israelites cry out to God. We see God command Moses to raise his staff. The people cross on dry land. Moses stretches out the staff and the water closes around the Egyptians. And so all of these things, we see God using something else. So we see God command Moses to stretch out his arm to separate the waters. We see him stretch out his arm to close the waters around the Egyptians. We see just this kind of middle factor. So we see God using the wind, a natural phenomenon. We see God using Moses as a mediator. And so this one really focuses on God using mediators, and so using people and things that we see every day. Um, and so, again, the two big things here, and this is what I really want to focus on, and I want to challenge you guys to think about this morning, is um, God being the subject of all action and God using us as mediators. Um, we like to say um, one of two things: either look what I did or look what God did. And sometimes it's both. Sometimes God uses us to do something, and it's okay to recognize that God used us to do that. And so I want to challenge you guys to start looking at it that way and start saying, like in this story of the Red Sea and the crossing, God used Moses as a symbol. One of the commentaries I read said that the reason that Moses had to stretch out his arm was to um, kind of just harden in and justify the fact that God was in control, because if this event just happened, if the water just dried up and then it went back, um, there would be no justification for non-believers to think that this was a true story. And so by Moses stretching out his hand, um, it shows that somebody was in control, and that person, our God, gave Moses the strength over that water to stretch his arm out and close it back around them. So a couple more things that I just want to point out going along with that is, one, I want to point out that God is intimately involved in the details and forces involved in the struggle of God's people. So God is intimately involved with us. He's intimately involved with our lives. He's intimately involved with our ministries, um, sometimes directly, sometimes through mediators, but God is always intimately involved in our lives. The second thing to take away from this passage that I really want to encourage is the way that God um, uses natural and hypernatural means of creation, um, both for judgment and salvation. And so in this story, we see two groups of people. We see the Egyptian army and we see the Israelites. And these natural and hypernatural events that God uses in this story um, both save and condemn a group of people. So we see the Egyptians become condemned, and they are sentenced to death basically in this moment. And then we see the Israelites who are given salvation. They're given freedom from the Egyptian army. They're moving on to the land of Canaan, um, and this is a good reminder for us that um, God is that mediator in the middle. God is the water that's being parted. And so another commentary that I read mentioned that some people liken this story to baptism. And so they talk about the dead Egyptians who are strewn across the seashore being a representation of our sin, our sinful nature. And then as you cross through the water, as we are baptized, we become a new creation. We're free from that sin, um, and we're no longer held accountable to it. And so this is a very important text, not just for the Old Testament and for understanding context and historical aspects of it, but it's also a reminder for us that when we are saved, when we have met Jesus, um, we are a new creation. The old is dead and gone, and the new is in front of us. And so um, I just found that really encouraging to know and to be reminded of how intimate our God is. We talked about this on Wednesday, how intimate God is and how intently He listens to us and He takes care of us. And so it was a great reminder then, and it's a great reminder today that God is involved with us intimately, sometimes directly, and sometimes through mediators, sometimes through a caring and smiling face, sometimes through um, a gift, a card being sent in the mail, the things that First Baptist is great at, sending cards to people when they come and visit, sending cards to people when they join as a member of our church. Um, and so all of these things can be used by God as an intimate setting to know His creation a little better. And so that's my encouragement to the church this morning, and to those who are listening, to just um, be willing to be that mediator for God. Be willing to be a smiling face, or to be an extended hand. Um, because you never know when God might use that situation to change somebody's life. Um, so, with that being said, if you would join me in praying this morning, I can't wait to see you in our worship service. So excited. If you can't make it this morning, please join us again on Facebook or YouTube. Uh, we would love to see and hear from you. Father, I just thank you for this time to just dive into your word and see the stories that have been compiled, um, just about your goodness, how intimate you are, the ways that you're involved in our lives, and the ways that you use situations both for judgment and for salvation, God. And um, all of those things being in your hand and in your power, God, we're just so grateful for. Because if it was in our hands, the decisions and choices that we would make probably would not be good. They would probably not be good for everyone. They might benefit us, but we're just so grateful that you're the one that's in control. Father, I ask that you just be with our church this morning as we meet for worship, and God, that you would just guide the words that come out of the worship service to touch the hearts of everyone in attendance and for those listening. God, I pray all of these things in your name. Amen.